Hi class, let's give a very brief overview of Chapter 7 and how to develop the research question and or the hypotheses for your research study. So I have the ambitious goal of trying to do this in about 10 minutes. So let's get started. Research questions, you remember, come at the end of your introduction section of the paper after that you have laid out an overview of the discussion surrounding your general topic, and then after you've developed this funnel that we keep talking about in your introductory discussion. You start general, and then you review your literature, and you highlight the major findings and the larger discussion about all the different variables related to your general topic. All the while in this funnel discussion and in this literature review, you're trying to narrow the discussion to focus on a particular purpose statement. And remember, this purpose statement comes toward the end of your literature review, and you can either have it arise out of noticing a deficiency in the previous discussion in the literature, where you identify maybe a unique aspect of a variable that might need further investigation, or you find some conflicting evidence from previous research and you want to go deeper and take a deeper look at some of the conflicting evidence to either replicate it or to challenge previous studies. Regardless, there are many different ways that you might find a deficiency from the previous research studies that you want to explore in more detail. The point, though, remember, of the introduction is to narrow down to a purpose statement that will turn into a focused research question. And the research question directs your data collection, and it leads into the method section that you'll be writing over the next couple weeks of our class. So, in the introduction, your funnel leads into a purpose statement, and then the research question comes out of that and acts, your chapter says, as a signpost for the reader. Okay, it guides the reader into what they can expect for your data collection and for ultimately the findings related to that research question that you ask. So you can already hear some warnings from me that the research question or the hypothesis should be focused, it should be specific, and it should be obvious what the variables are that you're actually going to collect data on. So let's talk about qualitative and quantitative research questions. Remember, we have two major branches of research, and so therefore, if you choose qualitative research and qualitative data collection, your research question will sound different than if you chose a numeric quantitative approach. So let's deal with qualitative. Qualitative research questions pose exploratory questions. Remember, they measure social phenomenon that's usually exploratory in nature on a new phenomenon or a poorly understood phenomenon, and often qualitative research findings will lead into future quantitative studies. So it will be no surprise that the types of questions that qualitative researchers ask are more exploratory in nature. And they come in two basic forms. So the central question is a broad overall question in qualitative research that sounds an awful lot like a purpose statement. But then you can also have sub-questions, more specific, directed questions that come out of the broad central question. So using this example, an article that I wrote off to the right, you'll notice that the central question of the study really comes in like the third sentence here. A grounded theory design, that's the data collection strategy, was employed to analyze interviews. That's not quite it. And here's the central research question related to participants' theological understandings of embodiment and sport. So that's kind of a fancy way of saying the central question is to explore and understand how do Christian professors think about their body and sport participation from the perspective of their Christian faith. That's the central question. But then sub-questions come out of that, and I'll show you those sub-questions in a second. But for now, remember, in a qualitative research study, the central question guides your data collection design or your strategy. And from there, you can choose a specific type of data collection method. So we'll get there in a couple weeks, but for now, remember, qualitative research has particular recipes for data collection. These are just a few. Ethnography, phenomenology, grounded theory, you can have a case study, you can have narrative. Remember, those are strategies for data collection, but these strategies come out of and are based on your central question. And in the case of this article, my central question related to developing a theory or an understanding of how these Christian sport faculty viewed their body and viewed participation from their Christian faith. So because I was really exploring in order to generate a basic understanding, I was going to use a grounded theory research design, because my central question was really trying to generate theory to better understand this unique phenomenon that was fairly poorly understood. Okay? So qualitative research questions often begin with language like what or how to convey their emerging design. So think about, how do people view sport and exercise from their Christian faith? Notice the exploratory and open-ended design versus a lab-based quantitative research question that would be much more action-oriented, to examine, right? To analyze. So qualitative research questions are often more emerging or exploratory in nature. And they actually avoid things like cause, effect, analysis, because they're primarily exploratory in nature. So once I've identified a central question, then also in my introduction and before the method section of your paper, you're going to develop some sub-questions to guide your data collection. So in my article, I need more than just this general understanding of how Christian faculty members, professors, view their body and sport participation. I need to know, I need to sort of codify that or narrow it into specific variables. So, for example, if you notice these questions below, these are the actual interview questions that I asked my participants. So this idea of human personhood, what does it mean to be a person, became one of the sub-questions or variables that I really wanted to hear their perspective on. Or the second, the relationship between your mind and body. Are they separate? Or are they the same thing? From the Christian perspective, how do you think about these things? Because your view of the mind and body, which is more important, is going to drive your view of sport and exercise and how valuable it is. Okay, so hopefully you can see these sub-questions are more directed and they're more focused on the specific, more narrow variables that you care about. Skip down here. What's your conception of a biblical understanding of the body? What is the importance of the body? And then how does the body relate to your Christian religious experience and or expression? So hopefully you notice now these are more specific ways of addressing the central research question, and that's the point of qualitative sub-questions. Okay, so throughout this PowerPoint, you'll notice examples, good examples from Chapter 7. I'm not going to read all of them. That's for you to go back and look at these examples throughout the chapter because they will give you language for your own study, and they will help you to guide you to writing specific research questions that are qualitative in nature for those who think that your general topic lends itself to textual, subjective, qualitative data. Let's move on to quantitative research and notice how different the language is. So, quantitative research, remember, is more traditional scientific method approach to addressing your topic of interest. So quantitative research questions and hypotheses often are concerned with the relationship among specific variables and even predictions about those expected relationships. And you can ask these questions in a few different ways. So quantitative research can either, at the top of the slide, ask general research questions, or they can ask more formal research hypotheses. So you choose whether you want a more general research question or you want to phrase it in a more hypothesis-driven way. But there are basically three approaches to how you would write research questions or hypotheses. The first is the most classic. You want to run an experiment where you have an intervention or a treatment and you want to compare groups based on one group who receives a treatment or a training approach or an intervention, and another group who, let's say, is a control who carries on with life as usual and does not receive your intervention or treatment. And you want to compare those groups to see, did the treatment, did the training program, or whatever your intervention is, did it have an impact on the group that received it in comparison with the group who did not? This would be a basic experiment. But sometimes you say, no, I don't want to do a formal experiment. I want to just test for relationship between or among variables. What happens as this group of athletes takes a supplement? What happens to some performance measurement or variable? I just want to check for the general relationship. Do they move up in relation to each other? The more creatine or the more protein supplement or the more caffeine, whatever it is, the higher the dose, does that increase performance in the same measure? Or is the relationship inverse? As one goes up, does the other go down? So sometimes a research question can get at the relationship between variables. And then a third type of research question will just be a basic descriptive study. This is often synonymous with this idea of a survey, where we're measuring people's opinions, beliefs, attitudes, perceptions related to a particular phenomenon, and we are capturing as many information from as many people as possible through a survey. So quantitative research questions and even hypotheses can often be asked in this third way, trying to describe a general population of participants. Regardless of the way you ask the question, though, quantitative research wants you to be very clear on what your independent and dependent variables are. So let's talk through a couple of examples of how to clarify your variables, and this is something you'll be working on as well. Look at the top here. Instead of, do coaches have different leadership styles depending on whether they're coaching a team or individual sport? That can sound like it's a pretty clear research question, but what do we mean by leadership style? What do we mean by team? What do we mean by type of sport? So as clear as that sounds, we need to be more specific in order to set up our data collection strategy. So this is a simple example, but look at the bottom now. We're looking at level of athlete, level of coach, type of leadership style, gender of the athlete. So then we get a much more sophisticated and specific research question once we narrow our variables in a more specific way. So here's another example of a generic question at the top. What is the effect of injury upon self-efficacy or the perception of competence of tennis players? Again, we need to focus the question and clarify and narrow our variables. So that's very important if you're going to have a signpost for the reader to know what type of data you're actually going to collect. Then your research question or hypothesis needs to be focused and your variables need to be clarified. So let's finish quickly and say the rest of the chapter focuses on how to write specific questions and hypotheses from a quantitative standpoint. So it talks about writing it in terms of a null hypothesis that says there are no differences or there's no relationship between variables versus an actual more focused relationship that says, there is a directional relationship. So here's an example of a null you can read through later. Here's an example of a directional hypothesis. We think that our intervention will have an impact and it will be in this type of direction. And then the chapter will finish with a discussion about mixed methods research questions. So enjoy reading, and thanks for listening.